So we're going from the coalface to the ivory tower. We are public policy analysts and advisors at Aither, and our experience is largely in looking at public policy from a user's point of view, whether it's the government or regulators, and trying to influence decision makers, most often at senior levels of government or in the Minister's office. And there are some others in the room who have had experience and exposure over a long period of time in that space, and so it should be a good discussion this afternoon. But what we're going to do on the basis of that experience is go back to Public Policy 101, just to bring you out of the research headspace for the next 20 minutes or so and consider public policy from a policy making and regulators' point of view. So what is public policy? Well, it's how government makes a difference. It's how government makes a difference and informs the decisions around the direction of resources, to what, where and when, and where resources don't go. So it involves responding to a problem with purpose and intent, despite what the last 6 weeks or 6 years might lead you to believe. Public policy is around responding to a challenge or a problem with purpose and intent, and there is some structure to it. It is structured. It involves making decisions, clearly, along the lines of that structure. But at the same time, it's political and it's dynamic, and so it does change and evolve. Now, there's been a whole range of attempts by various people to define public policy, but its meanings and its boundaries remain somewhat ambiguous. But we can agree that public policy is important without having to decide on a definition. But some of those that have been attempted are up there. Deciding at any time and place what objectives and substantive measures should be chosen in order to deal with a particular problem, issue or innovation. Often public policy, when thought of in those terms, is no more than whatever governments decide to do or not to do. It's as simple as that. Defining a course of action by government that will attain specific results. Now, of course, non-government, industry and private organisations have policies too, but the difference in government policy is that government can call on public resources and legal coercion in a way that others can't. But a lot of the decision making by industries will be similar to the considerations of government, and we can discuss that in some more detail. So the policy cycle, and some of you will be familiar with this, and sorry to be going over old ground if it's familiar to you, but the policy cycle describes the how of public policy. Almost every description of the policy cycle involves moving through three main stages, where an idea is developed, it's acted on, and the results checked. So the Australian Handbook of Policy Making refers to the idea of conceptualisation as ideation. Now, I'm not actually sure if that's a word, but they use it. But it's conceiving of an idea. Then the process of realisation and evaluation, or as we tried to interpret up there less formally, thinking, doing and testing. Now, that's at its most simple. It starts to get a little bit more complicated when you start to try and put it into action. So when you look at it in its component parts, the policy cycle involves essentially identifying the issue or problem, getting government to consider the action on the problem, considering what is proposed to be done about the problem, accepting a particular solution to the problem, applying the government's policy to the problem, and then asking if the policy worked. So there are a whole range of discrete considerations there in that sequence that researchers have an opportunity to engage and influence decisions that are being made, whether it's in the definition or identification of a problem, whether it's in the selection of a response, whether it's in aiding the implementation of that response, or as you work through the cycle, in evaluating, did it work? So research can clearly inform the policy cycle in different ways, and at different stages. And there's no fixed rules about this. Regulation, as was shown on the previous slide, is one of the policy tools that can be used. So if government sets a direction about a particular course of action, then it has in its toolkit a range of policy tools. It might be planning, it might be market-based instruments, and quite often, for some of the issues that we're interested in this room, it's regulation. And there are regulators who are with us today. So regulation is one way which governments implement their policies, and it plays a key role in the modern economy. Critically, it's often applied to high-risk issues, and that's why it's familiar to many of you in the room today, or where markets are unlikely to be effective, and it's enabled by legislation. Best practice regulation seeks to introduce or inform regulation based on evidence. So there's a clear role for research to influence that. So we've tried to conceptualise this in the following illustration in terms of the decision making that's faced by policymakers and regulators. We've seen through our description of the policy cycle that most often the development of policy starts with the identification of a problem, a challenge or an opportunity. We've heard a little bit about how looking at the opportunity as the flip side to a challenge or a problem is one way to conceive of it, but most often governments, for better or worse, will be dealing with problems or challenges as opposed to seeking opportunities. That's probably a key difference, as we've discussed, Matthew and I last night, between the idea of commercialisation, where you might be pursuing an opportunity from the outset, versus public policy and regulation, where you might be from the outset responding to a problem or a challenge. But if you can see from that, the starting point being a challenge or opportunity at the top. Working from the left-hand side, you can see that for any challenge or opportunity, there are more than likely existing policy or regulatory options that are being brought to bear to try and contribute to a solution or to deliver a particular outcome. Now, it may be that research can contribute to the way that those existing options are implemented to improve their efficacy. And so if we're talking about, for instance, the validation of recycled water technology, it may be that research can inform existing validation approaches and results without having to introduce an entirely new option or pathway. So the example there might be that new research shows that a particular technology can achieve a higher log reduction than was previously accepted, and that might improve the implementation of an existing solution by improving the efficiency of that process, by reducing the cost or removing a stage. Research can, in the next column across, clearly come in at an early part of the stage and help open a new option. So research can demonstrate that in addition to the existing options and in addition to improving the efficiency or the efficacy of those existing options, you can develop a whole new option. And there are examples of where research has broadened the options available to policymakers and regulators in dealing with problems. And lastly, it's not just a one-way street. It's not researchers just trying to influence policy and regulators in the way that they drive action to try and achieve outcomes. The course of policy making and regulatory implementation will raise questions, and it will identify areas that are fit for research or ripe for research. And so that last column there is really to say, through the process of policy implementation or regulatory action, there will be the identification of research areas. And so it's a two-way street. The onus isn't just on researchers to be out there trying to think about the decision-making process of regulators or policymakers, but policymakers need to engage and try and guide and better inform research. And quite often we see through research funding, we see it now that I'm on the other side of the fence and responding to clients, You see it in the specification of RFQs, the request for quote. But quite often, the funding body isn't really sure of the question that they're asking from the outset. So policymakers and regulators aren't always clearly articulating the question that they need answer or the input that they require. And so there's a challenge there. So clearly, that says there's scope for improved discourse and that there is importance in improving the discussion between policymakers, regulators and decision makers. So a simple example, and it's not dissimilar to the chain that was presented by Matt. So an example of a challenge, inconsistent or inadequate drinking water approaches. Now, research, and this was an example suggested by a regulator in this space, has been critical to delivering part of that solution. So to informing the various products and tools that have resulted, been accepted and implemented to improve drinking water quality and reduce public health risk. So it's a simple flow. But we know that we can do it. We know it happens, and there are plenty of examples of this communication, this discourse, and effective research contributing to improved public policy outcomes. Another example that was given stems from the centre, and the processes referred to earlier this morning around the validation framework and the development of validation protocols for water recycling technology, provided to us in discussions leading up to the workshop as being a really good example of researchers and regulators and policy people coming together to agree on priorities and undertaking research that's targeted to address that need. So we know that whether you're a policymaker, a decision maker, whether you're a regulator, if you're an industry body that's looking to establish directions and guidelines for the industry that you represent, there are a range of considerations that you'll consider when looking at options for trying to deliver improved outcomes in your sphere of public policy, in the environment, health or economic area that you regulate, or the industry that you're representing. And technical feasibility of those solutions will be a key criteria, but it's not the only criteria. And so as we say there, technical feasibility won't be a guarantee of adoption. And it's a point that we're reiterating from Matt's presentation. We didn't collude, by the way. I hadn't seen Matt's presentation. In fact, I hadn't met Matt until last night. I feel better that I have, but... So decision makers have a range of criteria. What are their objectives? Now, the objective of a policymaker might be quite different to the objective of a regulator. You need to be clear about what they're actually trying to achieve. What's the problem? And what do they see as the range of solutions? And that leads us to the options. Each option will have a range of costs and benefits. It'll have risks. Those risks might be social, they might be economic, they might be environmental. There'll be social factors, and the cultural issue was raised earlier. There are a whole range of other issues, considerations. What's the demand for that solution? What's the likely timing implication of that solution? You know, quite often we see a disconnect between the decision-making cycle of policymakers in responding to the pressing concern of the day and the research timetable or schedule. You know, so how do you deal with that disconnect? Again, in a former life, there have been plenty of times where I picked up the phone to ask researchers that we've been commissioning what I could say to inform a policy recommendation, because that's been my responsibility, to sit in a minister's office and say, right, this is the path that we advise you adopt. And so you get on the phone and you say, right, well, I know that we've got research in this space, thank Christ we funded that. And you ring up and you say, right, where are we? It's managed aquifer recharge in South Australia, and we want to know, is it a go? I say, well, that's a good question. I'm glad you've asked. If you ring back in 6 months' time, we'll be able to tell you where we're at. Well, that's fine. I go to the minister's office in 2 hours' time. What am I going to tell him? And so there's this complete disconnect in that decision-making timeframe. So often, influencing decision makers, yes, it's about having the best available information at the time that it's required. It's something to keep in mind. So what we're going to discuss this afternoon is how we do more to inform decisions that are being made. And we're going to spend some time thinking about the policy process and these decision-making criteria that I've put up. Because we know that technical feasibility, again, is not enough to guarantee adoption. So we want to consider what approaches we can take to helping ensure that new research and innovation is adopted and contributes to improved public policy outcomes in those areas that are a priority. So we'll think about the policy and decision-making criteria, and we'll think about how we can improve knowledge adoption or information sharing, working from these criteria and then taking that back into the projects. And that leads us to a fairly simple tool, which is the 4 Ws. And I added the 4 Ws because someone else had the 4 Ds. Now you'll see the 4 Ws. Well, this is all about expanding the way that we're thinking about this. So the 4 Ws: why, how, what, and who.
Well, there's a W in that.
So what we need to do is really think, and if we thought about nothing else, I'd urge us to think about the why. That is most often the least well articulated part of communicating research. Now, I've heard some very interesting presentations this morning, and there are some clear rationales and objectives for the research that's being undertaken. But what I found lacking from a non-scientist perspective in each of those presentations was a compelling call for what is the problem that we're contributing a solution to. Why is that important? Why should governments continue to invest in this area above and beyond all the other areas that we could invest in? You know, is it a water security challenge? Is it an environmental challenge? You know, is this the compelling public health? Is this the great moral challenge of our time? You know, why? Why is it important? And that's a really simple question, and we've talked about oversimplification, but it's a really simple question, but it can be powerful, and it's a really good one to keep bringing people back to. So research needs to address a particular public policy challenge or opportunity. How? Clarity is required around how the research is going to contribute to that challenge or opportunity. So yes, this is an issue of critical importance, and we can clearly communicate how this research is contributing to that. So we're matching challenge with solution. What? What are the products, the tools? What are the outputs they're going to be contributing that they support the how? And we heard lots of that this morning around the products and the outputs. What I would encourage us to think about is, let's not start with the project objectives or the project outputs. Let's start with, why is this project important? How is it going to contribute to a solution? And then let's look at the suite of products that underpin that. And it's a bit of a reversal. But if you have 30 seconds in an elevator to tell the minister why they should refund your centre, refund your project, then you don't want to spend the first 28 seconds talking about the various products that are coming out of that project. You want them on the hook about why that work's important, and it needs to continue. It has to continue because this is a critically important issue, and this is how we're contributing to it. And if you haven't got to the end of the lift yet, there's going to be a range of products coming out. So it's a different way of communicating the importance and the value of these projects, and knowledge adoption is all about realising value. That's what we're trying to achieve. So if we want to leverage the value and the investment of individual projects, of themes that the centre has funded, and enhance the centre's legacy as a whole, we need to be able to communicate this why. Who? Clearly you need to have in mind who's going to use the products. It's pretty critical. The whys continue, or the W's continue. You can say when, and that comes back to the timing issue as well. So you can add a when to that. So in summary, and we've saved a bit of time, I had it in mind to keep it a little bit short because I had the disadvantage of going after Matt and him stealing the thunder, but I had the advantage of being the presenter who got us to lunch earlier. So I'm going to keep it short, and I'm happy to take any questions. But we know, in summary, that research plays an important role, a very important role, in informing policy and regulatory outcomes, the whole way around that policy cycle. But it's not a given that the existence of new innovations or research and their technical feasibility will lead to adoption and implementation by policymakers. Sometimes, often, perhaps most often, policymakers, particularly when they're under time and budget constraints, will fall back on old solutions before adopting innovations. And that reflects this point that we're making around perhaps risk aversion, conservatism, or a focus on the downside as opposed to the opportunity. But that's what we see, is falling back on old solutions. So research needs to speak to the public policy challenges faced by policymakers, and you need to engage on their level. But you also need to demand direction from public policymakers and from regulators around research priorities. So that's this idea of it being very much a two-way street. Clearly, communication is critical in this. Policymakers need to connect problems with solutions and outcomes. And quite often they need to do that at a more strategic level than the detail that much of the research goes into. So I'll make no apologies for not being a scientist in this afternoon's session. A lot of those presentations I found very interesting, but I would have struggled at the end of them to be able to communicate back to you the essence of what I just thought I'd heard. Well, I could have communicated back to you. I probably would have been wrong. So that's a challenge. We can't just accept that we're all on the same page when it comes to understanding research and being able to communicate it, and we have to recognise the limitations of our audience. And those limitations are real when dealing with policymakers. Less so with regulators, David.
We're just simple folk.
So, that'll be a starting point for this afternoon. We're going to work through the decision-making criteria. We're going to work through the 4 Ys, or 3 Ys and the H, and see if we can't make some progress in simplifying some of these messages for a broader audience.